All right, so this is the last lecture of the semester, and I just want to emphasize that this is an optional, this is just optional material. I'm not going to test on any of this material, but I just wanted to share, take this last lecture to share a little bit about some of the research that I do. I'm typically engaged in aging policy research, so I do studies on the aging population, the different policies that affect our senior population. And so today I'll talk a little bit about SSI participation among the elderly, or really the issue is about non-participation in this program called SSI. And so you have the material for this week. You have the material on conservative proposals to eliminate our welfare system, namely the Charles Murray article. So please go ahead and read that article and comment on it on the discussion boards. But in the meantime, I just want to go through some of this research that I've been engaged in. And so this is what I'll cover for today. I'll talk a little bit about the program, this program called Supplemental Security Income. People sometimes tend to confuse SSI with Social Security. I'll talk about those distinctions. And so first I'll talk about some of the background. I'll note how the program came to be, a little bit about the statistics, what the typical profile looks like of a recipient. I'll look at some trends over time and the importance of the topic and the importance really of the program itself in fighting against poverty. And then I'll distinguish SSI, this program, Supplemental Security Income, from our Social Security program. People think they're the same, but they're actually different programs. I'll show a little bit about how the program actually operates. We've noted disregards, and there's a different calculation here. And so I'll go through how the program actually works. And then the actual topic that I've studied in the past is one of non-participation. So why is it that people, despite being eligible to receive SSI benefits, why is it that participation rates are so low? That's the primary issue that I take up in the last section here. So first, in the way of the SSI program, generally speaking, so Supplemental Security Income, we know, is a national program. It's federal. It's operated at the federal level. It's not just a state level program. So we have a national entity. This is a uniform. It's uniformly administered throughout the United States by the Social Security Administration. And so one of the reasons why people tend to confuse, I think, Social Security with SSI is because they're administered by the same agency. So the Social Security Administration administers both the Social Security program and the SSI program, but they're not the same. SSI is a public assistance program, so all the things that we've talked about in the way of public assistance will apply here. This is a program for the aged, for the blind, and for the disabled. So there's three different categories of persons who may benefit from this program. This was a program that's been in place for a while now, so not as long as Social Security, but it was first implemented during the Nixon administration in 1974. And as the title would suggest, it's a supplemental program. So it's intended to supplement supplement the earnings that people are receiving, or not the earnings, but I should say the income that people are receiving under their Social Security, under the Social Security program. So if we're looking at the typical profile of the SSI recipient, we note here that most people who receive SSI are in fact female. So a vast majority, close to 70% of all SSI recipients are in fact female. They tend to be older recipients, that is, and so the majority, or not actually the majority, but almost 40% of all recipients are older, are among the older, old generation, so 80 or older, and then most are in fact white. So close to 60% of recipients are in fact white. And you'll note that in looking at the composition, geographically speaking, most SSI recipients are in fact living in three different states here. So almost 50% of all recipients are residing in California, New York, and Texas, where we have large foreign-born populations. And so looking not just across all the different states, but across time in the way of the different people who are receiving SSI. So when the program was first implemented back in 1974, it was mostly a program for seniors. It was intended to be a program for seniors primarily to help them supplement their Social Security income. And so we know 57.2% initially were in fact 65 and older, or were receiving benefits on the basis of that category. But today, the vast majority of SSI recipients are in fact persons with disabilities. So upwards of 80% of recipients are in fact qualifying on the basis of their disability. So this is a program that's morphed into a program for persons with disabilities primarily today. So I asked the question here of why is this program important? And so we note that SSI is a program of last resort. It's an anti-poverty program. And so if we're looking at poverty, we've noted before in the way of general poverty, the poverty rates have increased. If we're just looking, let's say, at the last decade. So over the last 10 years, poverty has in fact increased from, we note here, 12.1% all the way up to 15%. So we've stabilized over the last few years, but overall poverty has increased. But if we're looking at poverty among the aging population, so among seniors, poverty has done the opposite, right? Poverty rates have in fact declined. It was 10.1% back in 2002, but now it's 9.1%. This is according to census data. So the census will report cross-sectional data. So essentially what they're saying is this is, it's the proportion of persons who are in the midst of a spell of poverty at any given point in time. It's a snapshot of people who are living in poverty. So that's what the picture seems like. But I argue in a separate paper and also here that basically there's sort of an illusion of economic prosperity for our elderly population. And so in one paper that I write in the Journal of Poverty, I look at 10-year poverty rates, right? So instead of just looking at a cross-sectional snapshot of poverty, I take the same people, I take a sample of 8,000 elderly individuals from the Health and Retirement Study, and I'm looking at their trajectory, their income trajectory, from the point of retirement in 10 years subsequent to that time point. And so I find that overall poverty, overall 10-year poverty rates among the elderly population is not 9.1%, but the risk of falling into poverty over a 10-year span is in fact 22.1% using Health and Retirement Study data. And I also look for disparities in poverty rates by race, ethnicity, and also gender, and I intersect those different categories to look at white males, white females, black females, Hispanic males, Hispanic females. Among those different groups, I find that the poverty rates, the 10-year poverty rates, are in fact highest for black females at 58.6% of all black females in that sample falls into poverty at some point during that 10 years after retirement. And then the second highest group that I find is for black Hispanic females. That's at 56.5%. So I argue in the paper that there's sort of an illusion of economic prosperity that we seem to interpret from the census data that's released every year. And so I want to distinguish here, take some time to distinguish between the two programs, that is Social Security OA SDI versus SSI. People conflate the two often, but they're certainly different programs. One is social insurance, right? Social Security OA SDI is in fact social insurance, and then SSI is public assistance, so we note all the different things that apply. And so with a little more detail, I'm looking at specific distinctions between the two programs. So in the way of program intent, so certainly when we're thinking about Social Security, the basic program goal is to make sure that we're protecting against a certain risk, right, as insurance programs do. We're protecting against the risk of lost income upon old age in the way of Social Security. But SSI is not an insurance program, right? There's no required contribution. It's a public assistance program, and it's a supplemental program. It's intended to supplement one's Social Security income. So people who aren't receiving much in the way of Social Security income, who may be falling through the cracks, who may not even be living at poverty level, they can supplement their Social Security income with SSI income. And of course, the eligibility requirements are different, right? Social Security requires contributions, namely 40 credits worth of contributions. There is no such requirement in the way of SSI eligibility. You have to be poor, so you have to pass a test of means, essentially, and you have to fall within a certain category of persons who can potentially benefit. That's either on the basis of age, or the basis of disability, or blindness. And of course, the benefit calculations, the way in which benefits are structured, are different for the two programs. We note that in the case of Social Security, it's based on your average index monthly earnings over your lifetime. They take your highest 35 years of earnings, and they take an average monthly amount, and they think about, and SSA thinks about the replacement rates. So you get back as a lower earner, right? Someone with a lower earnings history throughout your lifetime, you're going to get back a much higher percent of what you used to make. There's no such determination in the SSI program. The SSI program is based on a flat grant amount, what's called the maximum federal benefit rate. Basically, the government checks to see that your countable income is less than the prevailing federal benefit rate. And so these rates will differ from year to year. So for 2014, the maximum federal benefit rate is $721 for an individual. And if you're in a married relationship, the maximum federal benefit rate is $1,082. So if your countable income is less than those amounts, your benefits, you'll have some sort of positive benefit. And of course, the way in which the two programs are financed are different. With the social insurance program, we have a FICA tax, that's that 6.2% tax that works more favorably for the higher income worker. But there's no such financing in the way of SSI. It's just general revenue funding that comes out of our general revenue taxes. So this is just a little more detail in the way of how the benefit is calculated, how the SSI program works. I noted that your countable income has to be less than the prevailing federal benefit rate. That prevailing federal benefit rate changes from year to year, like the Social Security benefit level. Those benefit rates will also change depending on prices. So there's an automatic adjustment there. And then your assets have to be less than a certain amount. It's $2,000 for an individual, $3,000 for a couple. That hasn't changed since 1982 when those limits were first implemented. So I'm just showing here just a couple examples of how the program works. The program will distinguish between whether or not you have earned income, whether you've worked for your earnings, or whether you've worked for your income, or whether you're just receiving income from some other source. So this is, there are different disregard amounts depending on whether or not you have earned income or unearned income. And so suppose you have two people. Person A has unearned income. So let's say I'm giving my mom, let's say I give her $300 a month, right? So that income that she's receiving is unearned. And so the general income disregard applies to that income because it's not earned. So that disregard amount is only $20. So the government will disregard $20 of that amount when calculating your benefit. So only disregarding $20 of the $300 check that my mom is receiving, let's say, she'll get a check of $441 from SSA, from the Social Security Administration, right? And so the bottom line here is that person B, who may have the same amount of income, $300, but if it's earned, there's a much more generous disregard. So it's $65. Well, the person with only earned income will be entitled to both the general income disregard, the $20 income disregard, and an earned income disregard of $65 and 50% of all remaining earnings, right, when they calculate your benefit. And so bottom line, the person with earned income in the way of $300 gets back $613.50, while the person with unearned income only gets back $441. So recall that this is consistent with our program philosophy in terms of many of our welfare programs or public assistance programs, that we're trying to promote work, right? We're trying to reduce dependency and get people working. There's that work incentive that's built in. And so that's a little bit about the philosophy of the program. So this last section is a little bit about the policy issue that I find to be interesting here, and that's the issue of non-participation. So if we're thinking about basic theory, right, and I'm applying a basic economic theory, and more specifically I'm talking about consumer theory here. So from the perspective of consumer theory, what economic theory would suggest in the way of welfare participation is that if you have an opportunity to increase your income, to increase your utility, in other words, or increase your satisfaction at relatively little to no cost, then the theory predicts that you should readily do so. If given that opportunity, you should readily do so. So applying this theory to the context of potential welfare recipients, right, or potential SSI recipients, one would expect that if you're eligible to benefit from a program like SSI, that one would readily do so, but people don't participate to the extent that one might hypothesize, right? So the issue here is about non-participation. The basic question being, why is it that people given an opportunity to increase their income or increase their well-being or satisfaction at little to no cost, why is it that they're not doing so? And so you'll note that this is not just an issue that's limited to the SSI program, but this is across the board with most of our public assistance programs. So note here that in the case of SSI, that the participation rates, and by participation I'm talking about people who are eligible, people not just the entire population, that makes a big difference, but among people who are eligible to receive benefits, only about 45 to 60% actually participate or take up the SSI benefit. And you'll note that it's not just limited to the SSI program, but it's also in the way of our TANF program, our major welfare program. It's a similar range, 40 to 55% are the research estimates. Food stamps, somewhere in that range, but a little bit higher, 54 to 69%. a little bit greater participation in the food stamp program. Medicaid here, you'll note, is alarmingly low, 23 to 34%. Most research studies will find the rates to be a little less. And then, of course, I just throw in here the Earned Income Tax Credit, arguably, or a public assistance program, right? One typically doesn't think of EITC as a public assistance program, but I throw it in here because it does have a means test. There is a test of income that you need to meet to receive the EITC, the Earned Income Tax Credit. And so the issue that I take up in a separate paper in one of my research articles is about the explanations for non-participation and thinking about these hypotheses and testing for these hypotheses. 4 different explanations here. So one of the explanations, and the most popular among economists, is about the expected benefit rate, right, or the expected benefit level. Right? This is pretty commonsensical. You would expect that the higher the expected benefit for an individual, the more likely one is to participate. That's what that positive sign is, so that there's a positive relationship between the expected benefit level and the likelihood of participation. Another reason that social scientists put forth about why people don't participate is about informational reasons. So people aren't participating in programs like SSI or TANF because they don't have enough information about these programs, or maybe if they do have information, they're misinterpreting the rules of eligibility. And that's what this hypothesis would state. So these hypotheses aren't always tested for directly by social scientists or researchers. So they're done by way of proxy variables. And so you'll note here, one of the variables that's used to test for this hypothesis is educational attainment. Right? So one might expect that if this hypothesis were true, that people with higher levels of education would be more likely to participate because they would presumably have more information or be able to gather more relevant information about these different programs. But the relationship is actually negative. Right? That's what the research finds. So people with higher levels of education are in fact less likely to participate in welfare programs. So there's disconfirming evidence for this particular hypothesis. A third explanation for why people don't participate in programs like SSI is about difficulty in the application process. That it's sort of a bureaucratic maze that's involved in the way of applying for these benefits, and so people, there's the costs, in other words, are just too great for people to participate. And so once again, we don't necessarily test directly for this hypothesis. We use proxy variables like education attainment, the same variable that was used to test for the informational hypothesis. And so one might expect that someone with higher levels of education would be able to navigate that bureaucratic maze with greater ease. That's what the hypothesis would suggest. But as I noted up here, the relationship is actually negative, right? So those with higher levels of education are in fact less likely to participate, despite the fact that one would expect them to be able to navigate that maze with greater ease. And then finally, the last explanation that's put forth by social scientists is in the way of stigma, right? That there's sort of a general distaste for participating in welfare programs. And so one of the variables that's used to test for that hypothesis is in the way of food stamp participation, right? So one might expect that if you're more likely to participate in food stamps in the food stamp program, or what's now called SNAP, then you should perceive less stigma. You should experience less stigma, generally speaking, in the way of program participation. So you'd be more likely to participate in SSI if you're receiving food stamps. And the research does show some evidence for this hypothesis. There's a positive relationship. If you're receiving food stamp benefits, you're more likely to participate in SSI. And so there's some good evidence for the stigma hypothesis. So this is just a little bit of background in the way of this issue of non-participation in public programs. So we'll stop there. And so for this week, as I stated before, I'll expect you to go ahead and read the article, read the 2 articles, and pay close attention to the Charles Murray article, putting forth a proposal to replace our welfare state.